Good evening, everybody, and thank you all for being here for another episode of the Jewish Destiny series. It is such a pleasure to have you here tonight, such a pleasure to have you participate, and sorry for that slightly delayed start there. Just had to deal with some technical difficulties here in the studio. And with no further ado, because all of you have been waiting already, let's just get started and rock and roll. For those who'd like to follow along, I'm going to throw the outline into the chat box. And if you don't want to follow along, don't feel any pressure to do so. So that's coming your way. And there's the outline. And let's get started. Okay. Okay, welcome once again to everybody. And this is the Jewish Destiny series. I'm your host, Rabbi Landis, as you know. And tonight is part 11, The Wanderers, 40 Years in the Desert. So for those of you who were with us last week or watched it later on Torah Anytime or somehow caught up or whatever, or even if you didn't, we'll let you know what we were up to. We discussed last week, or we concluded last week with the discussion of the Golden Calf, which was a very cataclysmic event. It was an event that took the Jews from a very high level after they had achieved somewhat artificially, or at the very least somewhat quickly, and it brought them from that level, and they fell down to the depths of needing a cleanup situation. Now, Moshe's response, and his famous response of the Golden Calf, his response was that he smashed the tablets. Now, later on, the Almighty refers to the tablets as Asher Luchas Asher Shibarta, the tablets that you, Moshe, broke, to which our sages expound Yasher Kayach Asher Shibarta. It's a good thing that you did that you broke those tablets. In other words, while this was definitely Moshe, so to speak, acting alone, it was sanctioned very much by the Almighty. The Almighty felt that this was a proper thing to do, and that's what happened. And we discussed last week about the initial cleanup process that was necessary with the different levels of death that happened and all that. Now we go on to what happened next. Now, where are we on the Jewish calendar? We're obviously 40 days after the Exodus. If you do your math, that is equal to the 17th of Tammuz. It's very fitting they were having this session tonight because this coming Sunday, actually, this coming, one second, is it Sunday or Monday? I think it's in what we call a nidche. Let me double check here to give you the right information. Correct. This coming Sunday, it's not a nidche. This coming Sunday is Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. It's the fast day of the 17th of Tammuz. So it's very fitting that we discussed it last week. We're discussing it tonight. So the 17th of Tammuz is a fast day for a number of calamities that befell the Jewish people on that day. And one of those are the first calamity in world history that we're going to observe on the 17th of Tammuz. And one of the reasons we fast on the 17th of Tammuz was that was the day that Moshe smashed the tablets. Now, as usually happens, there's a concept actually that is explained in a number of places. Our very own Rav Dessler, now that's not our Desslers here in Cleveland, but the original Michtav Eliyahu, Rav Eliyahu Dessler, explains the idea of how there is what is called Hashpos HaKadusha. There's flows of holiness that come into the Jewish calendar. And that means that each calendar date on the Jewish calendar has a certain spiritual aura to it. So we see, based on this, we see on many of our national fast days, there were a multitude of calamities that happen on those days. And so too with the happy days, with the Yom Tovim, there's often a multitude of good things that happen on the auspicious days. So the 17th of Tammuz, the first thing chronologically that ever happened was Moshe smashes the tablets. Now, as we go on in the Jewish Destiny series, we're going to see there's several other calamities. This is a day where we observe the breaching of the walls during the destruction of the first temple by the hands of the Babylonians, the breaching of the walls of the second temple by the hands of the Romans. It's a day when a evil dictator, probably the times of the Greeks, named Epistomos Harasha, burnt a Torah scroll. It's a day when a idol was set up in the temple, probably by the wicked king Menashe, who we'll talk about in a few weeks. So again, a day, unfortunately, an infamous day, and that's why we observe it as a fast day. But the origination of the day was Moshe smashing the tablets. And that was on the 17th of Tammuz. That's when he came down. That's when everything that we discussed last week happened. So moving forward one day in Jewish history to the 18th of Tammuz. What happens on the 18th of Tammuz? Well, on this day, Moshe reascends the mountain. Now, Moshe is going to go up to the top of Mount Sinai a total of 3 major times. He went up really 4 times, one short time right at the beginning, but 3 times of 40 days. The first time we discussed already. He went up, he got the Torah, comes down, smashes the tablets. That's number 1. Now we're going into the second days, the second 40 days, which begin on the 18th day of the month of Tammuz and conclude on the 29th day of the month of Av. Now, what happens in these next 40 days? Moshe does one thing and one thing only. He spends 40 days negotiating with the Almighty and interceding on behalf of the Jewish people. In other words, the Almighty, after the transgression of the golden calf, wanted to wipe out the Jewish people and start anew with Moshe Rabbeinu. And because of this, Moshe uses basically every argument in the book. He says, I'm not up for that. I don't agree with that. I already tried giving up on the Jewish people, right? That's what we discussed last week. And Moshe leaves Egypt when he sees the terrible way that the Jews treat one another. And he says, I'm not giving up on the Jews again. And he says the fateful words that if you're going to wipe them out, you must wipe me out of your Torah, wipe me out of your book. Which the Almighty, to a certain extent, makes happen in one parsha from the Moshe's existence till his death. His name does not appear. That's looked at as his little being wiped out of the Torah in a small way. And in the end, the Talmud tells us that Moshe goes through every argument in the book for the Jewish people, and nothing works. Nothing works. The Almighty's mind is, so to speak, not changed. Again, whatever that means, that you can change the Almighty's mind, but the Almighty's mind is not changed. And finally, in the end of the day, and the end of the 40 days, Moshe says, Zechor, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember my antecedents, remember our patriarchs, that you promised to them that their descendants, not my descendants, their descendants were going to inherit the land of Israel. So you got to make good on your promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And finally, that was enough to sway the Almighty. And the Almighty said, okay, Moshe, I'm going to give them a second chance, but it's going to be different. It's going to be different. You can go back down and tell them that I have given them a second chance, but then you need to come back up a third time, because we're going to have to teach you the whole entire Torah anew. Now, why? Why was that necessary? We understand that in those first 40 days, Moshe learned the whole entire Torah. So if that's the case, why was it necessary then for Moshe to go up now a third set of 40 days to relearn the entire Torah? It's encapsulated in one of the commandments the Almighty gives to Moshe before he leaves the mountain to tell the Jewish people they've been forgiven and to come up the third time. And he says to him, Psal lucha shnei luchos avanim kirishonim. Engrave for yourself 2 stones of tablets just like the original ones. Now, what does that mean? That means, as our sages explain, that in the original, so to speak, teaching of the Torah to Moshe and the original status of the Torah, the understanding that the Jewish people were going to be able to achieve in the Torah was going to be very natural. In other words, they would be able to open, look at the Torah, and understand exactly what was expected of the Jewish people. Now, the Almighty said that even though they have been forgiven for the golden calf, there is definitely now a rift between me and them, and that relationship, how I originally taught it to, is changing now. It's not going to be so simple. And that's why if you've ever tried to delve into Talmudic studies and to the great mental rigor that takes, that's where it came from, so to speak. We can thank our antecedents for the golden calf, because that's why it, so to speak, became more difficult to understand the levels of the Torah. That's why there's a certain amount of obscurity and ambiguity around Torah ideas. And so therefore, the Almighty had to teach Moshe anew the Torah, and that's represented in the fact that the tablets are totally different. The original set of tablets that Moshe broke, we're told that the Almighty, so to speak, made those himself. Those were a godly creation. But now, for the second set, which represents the new relationship after the post-golden calf relationship, it's Moshe, you have to make the tablets this time. You have to carve the tablets. And that's to show the relationship that now the connecting to the Almighty, the understanding of the Torah is going to take much more effort of mankind, much more effort on the part of the Jewish people for us to be able to understand. So along these lines, Moshe ascends the mountain on the 30th of the month of Av. Now that is known to us as Rosh Chodesh Av. That's the first day of the month of, Rosh Chodesh Elul. When we have 2 days of Rosh Chodesh, it's always the last day of the previous month, the first day of the next month. And that's, again, a very auspicious date, because for us nowadays, and we really understand it as being instituted at that time in the year 2449 on the Jewish calendar, 1312 before the Common Era. At that time, that began the concept of Elul being a time for us to come back to the Almighty, for us to reconnect to the Almighty. Now, for us, Elul is the month preceding the high holidays. So therefore, that's the month where we do introspection, where we look into our actions, see where we can improve, see what we can do better. And that was, so to speak, etched in stone, no pun intended, or maybe intended, etched in stone at the time when Moshe goes up for the third time, because that third time on the mountain really represents the fact that the Almighty had forgiven the Jewish people, that and in those days, Moshe will become as close to the Almighty as he will get in his whole career, so much so that when he comes down from the mountain the third time, he has a physical glow to himself from the experience that he had with the Almighty, so much so that he has to wear a mask when he is henceforth in his life in the presence of the Jewish people, and that's what he does. And by the way, this is the source for Michelangelo's mistake of Moshe, because the Hebrew word for rays of light are karne or, which literally translate as horns of light. And therefore, that's where Michelangelo got the idea of Moshe having horns. And when he made his famous statue, he made Moshe with horns, and that began the concept of Jews having horns. So as with many things, and between us and our Christian cousins, as we'll discuss a lot of them, the whole concept of Jews, quote unquote, having horns is based on a mistranslation of Michelangelo. And because it talks about Moshe having rays of light, but the Hebrew word used for ray is the same as horn, so mistranslation. We're going to see another very famous one is the virgin birth, terrible mistranslation, and we'll get there eventually. But be it as it may, Moshe, when he's up on the mountain, achieves tremendous closeness to the Almighty, so much so that the Almighty, after he has retaught the Torah to him, he also gives Moshe Rabbeinu a recipe for the Jewish people, that when they will inevitably mess up in the future, when they want to return to the Almighty, they can invoke this recipe. And this is what we refer to as the Yud Gimel Midos Harachamim, the 13 attributes of divine mercy. And the Talmud tells us that the Almighty tells Moshe, when the Jews are in trouble, when they've messed up, all they have to do is wrap themselves like in a talus as if they were a chazan and say these 13 attributes of mercy. Now, for anyone who was ever in synagogue on on Yom Kippur, or for the Slichos service, you are probably familiar with these 13 attributes. It is Hashem, Kel Rachum V'Chanun, Erech Apayim V'Rav Chesed V'Emetz, Nosei Chesed L'Alfim, Nosei Avon V'Fesha V'Chatav V'Nakeh. Right? Or it's often saying in many synagogues, Hashem, Hashem, Kel Rachum V'Chanun. And that is the 13 attributes that the Almighty told Moshe to invoke when Jews needed to return to their Creator, to return to the Almighty. So that's one thing that Moshe gained in this ultimate closeness that he achieved with the Almighty. The second thing is that Moshe, or I guess the rays of light were the first thing, the 13 attributes the second thing, and there's a third thing that we see in the Torah, that at this time, Moshe Rabbeinu takes the opportunity to ask the Almighty. He says, show me your essence. He said, Hashem, I want to truly understand you. Now, Moshe was already the greatest of all prophets, the greatest prophet who ever was, the greatest prophet who ever will be. His prophecy is totally distinct from every other prophet. He definitely had the closest relationship. But at this closest point, for that closest relationship, he says, I want to understand it all, the Almighty. I want to understand your ways. Now, the commentaries tell us what was the question in truth that Moshe was asking at that point. He was asking the age-old, very difficult question of Tzadik v'ralo, Rasha v'tovlo. In other words, why do bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people? Show me your essence, Almighty. I want to understand how you make such decisions. How is it that one person can seem so evil, yet he has good in his life, and there's another person over here who seems so righteous, yet she has difficulties? Show me your ways, says Moshe to the Almighty. The Almighty responds, and the words that Moshe uses says, I want to see your face. And the Almighty says, no one can see my face and live, but I'll show you my back. And the Torah tells us that the Almighty puts Moshe into the cleft of a rock, and he passes by, and the presence of the Almighty passes by Moshe, and Moshe is able to see the back of the Almighty, to which our sages say he saw the knot of Hashem's tefillin. And the Talmud goes on to ask the question, what is written inside of God's tefillin? Very esoteric situation over here. But what exactly is going on? So we understand that Moshe was asking, God, I want to understand schar v'einish. I want to understand how you reward and punish, why things seem so backwards in this world. The Almighty said, you can't see that by looking at my face. The only way you can understand that is by looking at my back. In other words, you, Moshe, are asking to, in the moment, be able to understand why I have done what I have done. But you can't understand it like that. You know why? Because you're a mortal human being. Mortal human beings are bound by time and space. And therefore, you can only see what is right in front of you, right? The past has already happened. The future is yet to come. The present is a fleeting moment, but you live in that fleeting moment. And in that fleeting moment, you can't see all the details. But you know when you can, so to speak, see it all? After the fact, after the situation has passed, after the events have played out, you can look back and see, oh, now I get it. Now I see how these seemingly unconnected events, seemingly random events, seemingly painful quite often events, how they are in truth all connected and how they really had a divine purpose and are truly very meaningful. And that's what the Almighty said. You can't look at it head on and understand why I do the things that I do and how I do the things that I do. But with a hindsight of time, that's when you can come to an understanding. And that's what's represented in this concept that he saw the knot of God's tefillin. Now imagine for a moment what someone looks like when they're wearing tefillin, specifically the head tefillin, the tefillin shel rosh. So if you are not familiar with tefillin or seeing someone in tefillin for the first time, you probably look at them and say, hey, that guy over there is wearing a really, really funny hat and a funny scarf. Right? Because all you see is the black box, the bias on the forehead right here, and these two leather straps hanging down. So if you don't know what it is, you think it's a funny hat and a funny scarf. Like kind of like when people see tzitzis for the first time, Jew strings. They think they have these tassels tied to their belt, but we know it's really a four-corner garment going under the shirt. So anyways, you see the tefillin, you see the box, the two leather straps, and you think it's all unrelated. Funny hat, funny scarf, whatever it is. Maybe he just graduated and those are the robes they put on from his school. And that's what you think it is. But then if you look at the person from behind, you see the knot of the tefillin. You see, oh, 1 second. That funny hat is connected to a leather strap that ties in the back and comes down and comes back in front of him to form that funny scarf. So really it's all tied together, which you can only see from behind. As if to say, these events, looking head on, just like the funny hat and the funny scarf, look so random. But when you have the hindsight of time, you're able to see that they really are all tied together and really very much connected. And that was the third special answer, special relationships, special information, so to speak, that Moshe gained from his third time on the mountain. So Moshe finally comes down with the second set of tablets. And when he comes down, the people are ecstatic and they cry. because they realize that they have been completely forgiven and atoned for their actions of the golden calf, and their tears of joy. And the Medrash tells us that just like you cried these tears of joy on this day, these tears of happiness that you had been forgiven and atoned for. So the Almighty says, I'm going to establish this day as a day of crying for all generations, to cry these tears of happiness, these tears of forgiveness and atonement. And that, my friends, is the institution of Yom Kippur. So Moshe comes down with the second tablets, representing the ultimate atonement for the Jewish people from the golden calf, and the response of the Jewish people, the happy tears that they cried in response to that. Those tears, so to speak, says the Medrash, established Yom Kippur as an eternal day of forgiveness and atonement. So that was the creation of the holiday of Yom Kippur at that point, and the very first Yom Kippur we have recorded in history. So what happens next? After that first Yom Kippur, in fact, the day after the first Yom Kippur, the Jews begin a process of collecting all of the supplies needed for the Mishkan. Now, Mishkan is the Hebrew word. The English word that is given for Mishkan is tabernacle. But as I often say, that's one of those great English words that has absolutely no meaning. None of us really know what it means. So therefore, just going to stick to the Hebrew word Mishkan, because that's if we're not going to understand the translation, if not going to understand the meaning of the word, we'll just stick to the Hebrew. So they started building the Mishkan. Now, what was the Mishkan? The Mishkan, it really depends on which of the major commentaries you ask as to know what it was. At its physical core, what the Mishkan was, what the tabernacle was the portable temple that traveled with the Jews from this time period in the desert until the Jews enter Israel. For the first 400 years the Jews are in Israel until Solomon builds the first temple. So it's the portable temple in the desert. It is basically a stationary temple in the land of Israel. It's for most of its existence of those 400 years, it's in the town of Shiloh. And it is a portable temple that goes with the Jews. Now, at its spiritual core, what is it? And in truth, that's a dispute between the major commentators. Rashi tells us, and the Seporno tells us, that the whole concept of the Mishkan, and then the successor of the temple, both first and second, the whole concept was a result of the new relationship between the Almighty and the Jewish people. In other words, if it wasn't for the golden calf, says Rashi and Seporno, if the Jews had not messed up with the golden calf, there never would have been a Mishkan, and there never would have been a temple. Neither first nor second. Because Rashi explains, and the Seporno explains, that the relationship between the Almighty and the Jewish people, had there never been a golden calf, would have been that we could connect to the Almighty anywhere, wherever, whenever, however. We want to bring a sacrifice, we want to bring a korban, we don't need a temple, we don't need an altar, we could bring it in our backyards on the ground, explains this position. Every single place we wanted to, we could use to connect to the Almighty. That's how Rashi understands it. And once the Jews messed up with the golden calf, it showed that they needed a central focal point for themselves. They needed a temple. They needed that one place where they could come together to, so to speak, feel the Almighty's presence and connect to the Almighty and the spiritual way of bringing the korbanos, the sacrifices. But that was only necessary because of this new relationship, which we described before. That's how Rashi and the Seporno learn. Nachmanides, Ramban learns completely differently. He says that no, the Mishkan was always part of the original plan. The Almighty always wanted a Mishkan. He always wanted a temple. It had nothing to do with the golden calf. It's just that the Jews had to go through a cleanup process for the golden calf. And once they completed that cleanup process, then they could begin the process of building the Mishkan. And he says that therefore, what is the Mishkan? The Mishkan and the successor, both the first and second temple, were portable Mount Sinai's, or stationary in the case of the first and second temple. But it was for the Jews to keep a little bit of what they had achieved in Mount Sinai eternally. First through the Mishkan, then with the first and second temples. But be it as it may, everyone agrees that the process of building the Mishkan begins the day after Moshe comes down with the second tablets. So our sages teach us that for 4 days, the Jews collected all of the items that they needed to build that Mishkan, and they began building the Mishkan on the 15th day of the month of Tishrei in the year 2449 on the Jewish calendar. This, if you know your Jewish calendar, is the holiday of Sukkot, right? There's a whole discussion why Sukkot falls in the fall, why Sukkot is not in the spring, if it's commemorating the way that the Jews lived in the desert with the clouds of glory and the booths that they sat in, then do it right after Pesach when they first sat in those booths or in the clouds of glory. Why are we doing it in the fall? So one of the reasons given is the connection between the concept of the Sukkah and the concept of the Mishkan. And the day that the Jews began building the Mishkan in the desert was the 15th day of the month of Tishrei, and therefore that's one of the reasons that the holiday of Sukkot is observed starting on the 15th day of the month of Tishrei. I think this is one of the reasons also why in the way that the Christians translate Sukkot is that it's the Feast of Tabernacles, right? They draw that connection with that great English word that we don't know the meaning of. But be it as it may, that's one of the reasons why it falls when it falls on the calendar. So the Jews begin the process of building the Mishkan. They start on the 11th day of Tishrei, collect all the items, put the first nails in on the 15th of Tishrei, and they complete the building of the Mishkan on the 25th of Kislev, say our sages. Now, if you know your Jewish calendar, you know that the 25th of Kislev will later become the holiday of Hanukkah, when the Jews in the time of the Second Temple, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, when the Jews kick out the Greeks and the Hellenized Jews that had defiled the temple and rededicate the temple. Again, a little bit of an esoteric connection, that same idea that when the flows of holiness come into the world, they can be actualized in many different ways. So here the Jews complete the building of the Mishkan on the 25th of Kislev, and many generations later will rededicate the temple at the time of Hanukkah on the 25th of Kislev. Now, even though the temple is completed on the 25th of Kislev, it's not dedicated, it's not put into activity until the first day of the month of Nisan. So once the Jews come back to the anniversary, this now is the first anniversary of the month of the Exodus, that's when the Mishkan is actually dedicated, and that's when it goes into action. There's an 8-day process at the beginning of the month of Nisan, and then on the 14th of the first, this would I guess be the first year, the completion of the first year in the desert, the Jews do bring the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering. This is the only time it's brought in the desert. The Jews will not bring the Passover offering again until they enter the land of Israel 39 years later. Whole discussion as to why not. We don't need to get into it now, but be it as it may, that's what happens that's how they celebrate and observe the usage of the Mishkan for the first time. They have 8 days of celebration, and then 6 days or 5 days later, bring the Passover offering. What happens next? Next, quite simply, the Jews prepare to enter the land of Israel. Because again, in our original plan, the Jews are supposed to enter the land of Israel right after the 17th of Tammuz, right? Had it not been for the golden calf and the necessity to go through the cleanup process, the Jews would have started their process of entering the land of Israel, according to Rashi, right after receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai. And we probably would have been there, a week or two later. According to Ramban, who says the Mishkan was always part of the plan, they still would have had to build the Mishkan, and then they would have entered the land of Israel. But in total, it would have taken the whole process no more than a year if it wasn't for the golden calf, maybe 6 months tops. But now we have something else happen. We have another very complicated event that takes place, and that is on the 29th of Sivan. Again, this is now the second year in the deserts. This is the year, the Jewish year 2449, 1312 before the Common Era. On the 29th of Sivan, the Jewish people come to Moshe and they say, Moshe, we're about to enter the land of Israel, but we don't know what we're going to find there. Maybe we should send some spies. Maybe we should check it out. Maybe we should see what it's all about before we just plunge ourselves into the situation of entering the land of Israel. So Moshe at that point asks the Almighty a question, as to if these spies are good for the Jews, bad for the Jews. Should they enter land? Should they send spies before entering? Should they not send spies before entering? To which the Almighty responds, Shlach lecha anashim. You can send for yourself spies. In other words, if it's up to me, you don't need spies, right? Because, hey, I'm the Almighty. I control the world. I'm promising you the land of Israel. I have a pretty good track record of miracles at this point. Even when these people messed up, I still gave them a chance to come back. And you don't need spies. But if they're insisting on doing things the normal way, if they insist on doing things the practical way, if they want to be pragmatic and send in spies before they enter the land of Israel, that's fine. We can be pragmatic. We can be practical. We can send in spies. You can make that decision and you can send them in for yourselves. I'm telling you, you don't need it. But if you send those spies, there's going to be a very drastic consequence. And that is, if they rely on the faith that I believe they should have built up at this point, I'm going to take them into the land of Israel. The 31 Canaanite kingdoms, the 7 Canaanite nations that all exist in the land of Israel, they're going to flutter away without a shot needing to be fired, without a fight needing to be fought. And just like everything in the desert is supernatural, your entering into the land of Israel will be completely supernatural. But if you make the decision to need spies and be pragmatic and practical and not rely on your faith in the Almighty, that's fine. But then the whole entering and conquest of the land of Israel is going to be practical and pragmatic and natural. And a lot of the miracles that you've experienced here will not exist at the time of entering the land of Israel. So when we talk about next week, the conquest of the land of Israel, that is only necessary, again, because of another not so great decision that the Jews make and wanting spies being sent before they enter the land of Israel. And as we're going to see, the situation is really much more serious than that. Because what happens is the spies go into the land of Israel, one from each tribe. And these were great men. These were the leaders of the tribes. And they're sent in. And when they get into the land of Israel, they see giants, they see giant fruit, and seemingly they become scared. Now, according to our sages, they might have had ulterior motives. They might have just wanted to, they thought that when the Jews enter the land of Israel, they will no longer be in positions of leadership. So therefore, they wanted to so to speak, stay in the desert where they'd have a position of leadership. Be it as it may, when the spies 40 days later come back to the Jews in the desert, 10 out of 12 of these spies give a negative report. They say the land, it's beautiful, it's great. Got big produce. We brought you some examples here, but you got giants there, and I'm not so sure we can conquer it, and I'm not so sure this is a good idea. And they give a negative report. They do what our sages call it, speak dibas haaretz. They speak lashon hara. They speak slander on the land of Israel. Now, it's interesting to point out, has anybody ever seen the emblem or the logo of the Ministry of Tourism of the State of Israel, the modern day State of Israel? You'll notice, if you look at it, you can Google it right now if you would like, that it is a drawing, a caricature, a logo, if you will, a silhouette of two men carrying a very large cluster of grapes. Now, what is that all about? That's our spies that we're talking about now, because our sages say they came back with fruit. And the Ministry of Tourism has taken this concept and made it their emblem, which whoever came up with that needs to be fired, because that is terrible marketing. Because here they took a story, which were the very first tourists ever to enter into the land of Israel, and they came back with a negative report. And you make them your logo? Makes no sense. Whoever decided that needs to be fired. But be it as it may, that's the spies. 10 out of 12 spies come back with a negative report. The two who, so to speak, were defending the land of Israel were Joshua and Caleb, Yehoshua and Caleb ben Yefuneh, and they tried to reason with the Jewish people. They tried to argue with their 10 compatriots who went with them into the land of Israel, but it was all for naught, because we're told in the Torah that the response of the Jewish people was to listen to the negative report of the 10, and on that night, the Jewish people cried. and they cried and they cried and they cried. And the Almighty looks at the situation and says, we got a problem here. If after everything we've been through, you can still have so little faith in me that you're crying about entering the land of Israel, then we have serious problems. And because of that, you, the generation that went out of Egypt, you, the generation that saw the 10 plagues, you, the generation that witnessed the splitting of the sea, you, the generation that's eaten manna from heaven, that drank water from the well, and you, the generation that stood at Mount Sinai, you are not going to be able to enter the land of Israel. You have shown me that you are not fitting to enter this land, and you are going to die here in the desert, and it'll be your descendants who will enter the land of Israel. And the Talmud tells us that because the Jewish people cried this meaningless cry on that night, the Almighty established that night and that day as a day of crying for all generations. And that, my friends, was the very first Tisha B'Av. And established Tisha B'Av as a national day of Jewish mourning, to which we're going to see many, many subsequent tragedies happen on this very day. Now, you can think about this statement here, and it's kind of interesting. The Almighty says, basically, I'm going to establish this as a terrible day for you throughout history. The first temple is going to be destroyed on this day. The second temple is going to be destroyed on this day. The city of Beitar at the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt will be destroyed on this day. The Romans are going to plow over the Temple Mount on this day. The Jews are going to be kicked out of Spain on this day. The Jews are going to be kicked out of England on this day. World War I, which was the beginning of the destruction of European Jewry, will break out on this day. So what exactly is going on over here? I mean, think about it. It's like a father who walks into a room and finds his child crying. He says, you're crying? You're crying meaningless tears? I'm going to give you a reason to cry. Boom, boom, boom. Like, what would we do? We'd call social services on that father. Yet this is what our sages say the Almighty's response was to the Jews crying this meaningless cry, listening to the negative report of the spies. How are we to understand such a thing? So in truth, we have to understand in general that when we talk about, so to speak, punishments from the Almighty, they're not retribution. They're not just that we have to be inflicted with punishments because we did something wrong. They are spiritual realities. And that's exactly what happened here. And we see it very much in the words that the spies said when they returned and gave their negative report. What did they say at that point in time? They said to the Jewish people that v'nehi be'einehem kechagavim, that when we were in the land of Israel, we appeared as grasshoppers in their eyes, and so too were we in our eyes. In other words, we felt small. We felt insignificant. We felt like we were nothing. The Almighty says, you still feel like that after everything you've been through? You cannot go into the land of Israel. And not only that, but as long as this attitude is part of the spiritual DNA of the Jewish people, this is going to be a pretty rough day throughout all of history. Because we as a Jewish people, when it comes to the concept of Tisha B'Av and the concept of the tragedies of Jewish history, which we will discuss many of here in this series, we have to understand that the reason that it happens is because of this negative trait in our DNA of v'nehi be'einehem kechagavim, that we think we're too small, we think we're insignificant, we think we're grasshoppers. And until we can get rid of this trait in and of ourselves, we're never going to see, God forbid, the ultimate redemption of the Jewish people. So that's our goal as Jews, to realize the greatness of the Jewish people, realize we're not grasshoppers, realize we're the chosen people, and realize that we are meant for greatness. And when we realize that and internalize that, then there will be no more Tisha B'Av, and there will be no more need for the tears that have been cried for all generations on the day of Tisha B'Av. But it's interesting to point out that if we look at the observance of Tisha B'Av, it mirrors another day on the calendar, the one we mentioned before, Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av are the only two 25-hour fasts on the Jewish calendar. They're the only 2 days where we have the 5 prohibitions, not just not eating, but it's not eating, drinking, anointing, bathing, marital relations, wearing leather shoes, all forbidden on both days. and they have a lot of similarities. The way that it was once explained to me is that Yom Kippur is like a day in heaven. We try and be like angels. Tisha B'Av is like a day in hell. But I think what's even more fascinating is that both days, if you were paying attention, came from the same exact action: tears, crying. We mentioned that Yom Kippur was established when the Jews cried tears of joy that they had been forgiven, that they had been atoned for. And because of that, the Almighty says, I'm going to establish this as a day of crying for all generations, to cry these tears of happiness for forgiveness and atonement. Now, on this day of Tisha B'Av, when the Jews cried the meaningless tears, the Almighty says, oh, you're crying meaningless tears? I'm going to establish this as a day of crying negative tears for all generations. So we see from there the power, the true innate power of tears when used properly, and God forbid, when used improperly. So the decree was this generation was to die in the desert before they could enter the land of Israel. Now, the way the Jewish law works is until somebody is 20 years old, they cannot be punished in a Jewish court. Now, we all know that we become obligated in mitzvos and the commandments of the Torah for boys when they're 13, for girls when they are 12, but we cannot be prosecuted or, so to speak, held accountable in a court until we are 20 years old. So because of that, the way that it worked is everybody who was at least 20 at the time of the spies, those people are going to die in the desert, and their descendants would be the ones to go into the land of Israel. And when would they die? They would die on their 60th Tisha B'Av. On their 60th Tisha B'Av. So what did that mean? If we look in the Torah, and it's the parshas we're right up to, if you're following the weekly Torah reading, we read last week about Korach's rebellion, which we'll talk about in a moment. Korach's rebellion happened shortly after this time period of the spies. But then we go into, that was 2 weeks ago. Then we go into last week's parsha, Parshas Chukas, and that takes place in the 40th year. And we don't know anything in between. The Torah will eventually tell us where the wandering was, but no details, no stories, no situations. Why? What happened in those years between Korach's rebellion, between the spies, and between Moshe preparing the Jewish people to enter the land of Israel? You know what happened? The whole generation died out. That's the only thing that's significant that happened. And that's why when we pick up in the 40th year, we read about the golden heifer and the red heifer, and the way that we remove death aura, tumas mace, from ourselves. But what would happen is every year on Tisha B'Av, the people who had reached their 60th Tisha B'Av would dig graves. Very morbid idea that the Talmud says. They would dig their own graves, and they would lay down in their graves that night. And the next day, everyone else would wake up and they would go and bury the people who had died. So all the people, every year, there's only one day they would die on that day of crying for all generations on Tisha B'Av. And then they would be buried on the next day by their families. Until one year, when the people who thought it was their time to die laid down in the graves, and the next morning everyone got up. And they said, well, our calendars must have been messed up. This was the day before iPhones and subatomic calendars and all these things. They only had sundials or whatever it was. They said, we must have thought that last night was Tisha B'Av, was the 9th of Av, must be tonight. And they laid down again. And the next day, everyone got up. And they said, we must still have it wrong. And laid down again and again. Until one day one night they look up and they see a full moon in the sky. Now, on the Jewish calendar, what does a full moon mean? As a matter of fact, there'll be a full moon. It's almost full tonight, but 2 nights from now, will be completely full. What does a full moon mean on the Jewish calendar? It means it's the middle of the month, right? 15th of the month. There you go, Deanne. 15th of the month, because we have a lunar calendar, really a Sunni lunar calendar. We have a lunar calendar that corrects for the sun, but we have a lunar calendar. So the middle of the month is always a full moon. So once they saw the full moon, they said it has to be that Tisha B'Av came and gone, and it has to be that the decree is over. Now, the question is how they make the mistake. The answer is that they knew it was going to be 40 years because the spies were in the desert for 40 years. The spies' mission was for 40 days. So it was 1 year per day. But what the Almighty didn't tell them is that they were going to be granted time served. In other words, the first year and a half of their being in the desert counted towards the 40 years. So therefore, they thought they still had 2 years left. And really, they were already at the 40th year. That's how they made that mistake. But anyways, everyone wakes up and they realize we're going to be the ones who are going into the land of Israel. And that day also became a minor holiday on the Jewish calendar, known as the 15th day of the month of Av, or Tu B'Av. That is when Tu B'Av, so to speak, becomes established on the Jewish calendar as a happy day. Now, before the Jewish people enter the land of Israel, we see that the leadership, who is not going to be privileged to go into the land of Israel, passes on. Now, the first one to pass away was Miriam. Miriam passes away, seemingly of natural causes, for whatever it was. And when she dies, the well that was known as the Be'er Miriam, the magical well or the spiritual well that traveled with the Jews in the desert, it ceased to exist. And the Jewish people cried for water. And Moshe, this was last week's parsha, Moshe makes the mistake of, even though he was told to talk to the rock, he hits the rock. And because of that, the Almighty says, oh, Moshe and Aaron, you can't go into the land of Israel. It's going to have to be Joshua who's going to take the Jews into the land of Israel. Now, how do we understand that? How do we even understand that? So if we look back to the beginning of the sojourn in the desert, we see that when the Jews first, so to speak, ran out of water, how was water brought forth from the rock? Moshe hit the rock. Now, over here, when it's necessary to once again bring forth water from the rock in the 40th year, what does Moshe do? Well, he's told to speak to the rock by the Almighty. The Almighty changed the action, but he, in turn, goes ahead and hits the rock, and the Almighty says, you messed up, you didn't listen to me, you didn't sanctify my name in front of the people, you cannot take the Jews into Israel. What happened over here? So the way the Meshech Chochmah explains it is that the Almighty, so to speak, wanted to perform a great miracle in front of the new generation that was going to go into the land of Israel. Because remember, these people did not see the splitting of the sea, did not see Mount Sinai, did not see the 10 plagues, they didn't see any of that. So while they had seen the manna and they saw the well, the travel with them, and they saw the clouds of glory and the pillars of fire, that was all regular. That was all their everyday experience. Similar to when you and I walk outside, we don't appreciate the miracle of gravity. The fact that if it wasn't for gravity, we'd go floating up until whatever, maybe we'd be able to fly. Or we don't appreciate photosynthesis, or we don't appreciate the phytonutrients in our food, or whatever it is, because we're used to it every single day. So therefore, we don't look at it at all as miraculous. And that's how the Jews who were born in the desert looked at it. They didn't look at manna as miraculous. That's how it always was, always is, always will be. They didn't look at the water that came forth from this rock as miraculous. That's how it always was, how it always was, is, and will be. So therefore, the Almighty said we have to make a miracle so that they understand, just like the parents, exactly what the abilities of the Almighty are. So the Almighty tells Moshe, speak to the rock. In other words, we're going to do an action that makes it very clear that I, the Almighty, am the one running the world, and I can manipulate nature however I want. I let the rock stop giving forth water, and by simply asking the rock to bring forth water, a miracle will be performed for more water to be brought forth. Moshe's mistake was like this. If you look at the complaints that this new generation lobbied or extended to Moshe when they asked for water, it was very similar. It sounded very familiar to the complaints lobbied by their parents. Why did you take us out of Egypt to die here in the desert, not give us water? Very similar to the complaints of their parents. So which Moshe says, so I see here that they're complaining about why did I take them out of Egypt and not provide water in the desert? I didn't take them out of Egypt. They were born here in the desert. They never saw Egypt. Why are they complaining about going back to Egypt? They sound just like their parents. So Moshe says, one second. If they clearly got the negativity from their parents, they must have also gotten the positivity. In other words, if they can fetch, like their parents, wanting to go back to Egypt, and they never laid eyes on Egypt, they never saw Egypt, they're born here in the desert, it must be that their parents instilled in them what happened to the 10 plagues, what happened to the splitting of the sea, what happened to Mount Sinai. They must know about all that and have that all as well part of their tradition and their education. So Moshe said, the Almighty never wants to perform a miracle if he doesn't have to. Miracles are used for certain situations and certain experiences. So therefore, let's, just like they got the education from the parents, they complain with the parents, they must have gotten the good from the parents. They don't need such a major miracle. Let's do a less obvious miracle and do it the first way, and we'll hit the rock. The Almighty says, Moshe, you should have listened to me. Because you know what's going to happen now. Yeah, they learned how to kvetch from their parents because, hey, people learn how to kvetch. It's one of the things we learn how to do quite rapidly, quite quickly in our lives. But they still didn't experience the miracles. And now they saw you hit the rock and they saw you bring forth the water. They're going to think you're me. They're going to think you and Aaron are the divine spirit. They're going to think you and Aaron are the almighty being in this world. And therefore, if you are to complete this project and take them into the land of Israel, they will deify you. They will turn you into gods, and we cannot have that. So again, not a punishment, but a reality of the situation is you can no longer take the Jewish people into the land of Israel. You both must die here in the desert. And Aaron dies shortly after. And then Moshe begins the process on the first day of the month of Shvat of reviewing everything before he sends his main disciple, Joshua, to take the Jewish people into the land of Israel. And that's what we call Mishnah Torah, which is the name that our sages give to the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is just a Latin translation or Greek translation, which we've taken into English, which means Mishnah Torah, which means the second Torah or the repetition of the Torah, because a lot of what the book of Deuteronomy is a review of everything that's happened over the past 40 years. And that's Moshe's final will and testament to the Jewish people. He says it over the course of 1 month. We read it in shul over the course of about 10 weeks, starting in 2 weeks. But that's his final will and testament. So a lot of it is a review of what happened, a review of the commandments, but there's some interesting prophecies there that don't appear elsewhere in the Torah. And I always say one of the most fascinating prophecies is the fact that Moshe tells the Jewish people what all of Jewish history is going to look like. He says, you're going to go into the land of Israel, but you know what? Don't get too comfortable because you're going to screw up. You're not going to be there for that long. You're going to be exiled by a nation who speaks a language that you don't understand. You're going to be dispersed throughout the whole entire world. You're going to be afflicted, oppressed, beat up upon. The nations of the world are not going to make it easy for you, but through all that, you're going to survive. Even though the nations of the world are going to constantly try to stop that survival. As we say in the Pesach Haggadah, B'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu l'chaluseinu, in every single generation, they rise up to try and kill us. Ela Kodesh Baruch Hu matzilenu miyadam, but the Almighty always saves us from their hands. So says Moshe, you're going to survive a very tumultuous history. And in the end of days, you're going to return to the land of Israel. Now stop and think about that for a minute. If you're a Moshe, circa 1273 before the Common Era, 2488 on the Jewish calendar, would you have made such a prediction, such a detailed prediction? You're going to go into the land of Israel. You're not going to stay there. You're going to be sent around the world. You're going to be beat up, oppressed. They're going to try and kill you many a times. And in the end, you're going to not only survive all that, but you're going to return to your ancestral homeland and rebuild the Commonwealth. How in the world would he have made such a prediction, such a prophecy, and still expect the Torah that he was writing down to be accepted as a book of truth and a book of fact if he didn't have such an eye on history? Because think about it. You change any detail of that prediction, of that prophecy throughout history, and all of a sudden the Torah is moved from the fact shelf to the fiction shelf. But no, Moshe, in making such a bold prediction, must have, being the greatest prophet of all time, had that eye on history and knew what our destiny was going to look like. And for those of us living in 2021, we look back on that prophecy and say that, you know what? It happened. I mean, as I always say, we are the first Jews in 2,500 years since the destruction of not the second temple, since the destruction of the first temple, to see the majority of the world Jewish population living in the land of Israel. Because as we're going to discuss, in the Second Commonwealth, not all the Jews go back. The majority actually stay in Babylon. But We're the first one since the year 440 before the Common Era to see the majority. 450 before the Common Era to see the majority of the world Jewish population living in the land of Israel. And as I always point out, the famous statement from Yaakov Emden, how this is the most miraculous thing ever to happen on the map of world history. The fact that this prophecy of Moshe has come true to a T, because we were, in fact, kicked out of the land of Israel. We were, in fact, dispersed over the whole entire world. We were, in fact, oppressed, afflicted, went through attempted genocides over and over and over again. Yet in the end, we've survived it all. We've beat them all, and we're still here. And not only that, but the majority of our nation is now living in that ancestral homeland that Moshe Rabbeinu told us that we would go into and told us we would hold on to in the year 1273 before the Common Era. So if anyone ever tells you that if there were miracles, if a miracle would only be performed, then they would be a believer, tell them to come join us in the Destiny series and study a little Jewish history, because that's where we see the ultimate miracles of Jewish history. So after Moshe tells his whole entire book of Devarim, final will and testament, book of Deuteronomy, on the 7th day of the month of Adar, and the year 2488 on the Jewish calendar, the year 1273 before the Common Era, Moshe takes leave of the world on the 7th day of the month of Adar, which was also his birthday. He lived exactly 120 years. He passes the mantle of leadership on to his main disciple, Joshua, and Joshua readies the Jewish people to enter the land of Israel. After a month of mourning for Moshe, they're going to mourn for a total of 30 days, the Shloshim concept. The Jewish people mourn for the 30 days. And then on the 7th day of the month of Nisan, they will begin the process to enter into the land of Israel. And that's where we'll pick up next week, talking about the Jews entering the land of Israel and the conquest of the land of Israel. So at this point in our history discussions, we have basically finished the Chumash. We finished the history that we take from the 5 books of Moses. And next week, we will begin the history that we see from the books of our prophets. I thank you all for coming. I thank you for listening. Any questions? Let's see in the chat box here. Okay, thank you, Deanna. Lovely, I appreciate that. Any other questions? You can put them in your chat box, or you can unmute yourself and speak them out. Okay, mic drop. I guess it was clear. Again, as always, feel free to email me, text me, call me with any questions you might have. I thank you all for coming. I'll give you all a call to action before we wrap this up. We've been getting great feedback, first of all, for those of you who participate in Zoom every week, but also for those people who are not able to participate in Zoom and watch it later on Torah Anytime or on our website. And I want to ask you all to do me a favor. If you're enjoying this series, whether you're watching it here with us tonight or watching it later, please take a few minutes and forward the link to the series on to 5 of your friends you think might enjoy it. Help us get a few more people here. Help us to promote the class, because you, as the ones who are here every week, are the best evangelists for this class. And I hope you'll help me to really share the miracle of Jewish destiny with other Jews. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful week. Have a very meaningful fast on the 17th of Tammuz on Sunday, now that you know what it's all about. And I'll look forward to talking to you all next week. Thank you very much.